The chandeliers above the ballroom glowed like frozen stars, their light spilling softly across polished marble floors and carefully arranged tables. Music floated through the air, gentle and celebratory, the kind that made people smile without thinking. This was supposed to be a perfect night. Isabella Drake stood near the edge of the room, fingers resting lightly against the stem of her glass, her posture calm, her expression composed. To anyone watching, she looked confident, elegant, completely in control. The deep sapphire dress she wore caught the light every time she moved, matching the quiet strength in her eyes. This evening was meant to celebrate her engagement. Friends, colleagues, investors, distant relatives, they had all gathered to toast her future. The future everyone assumed she had carefully planned. Across the room stood the man she was supposed to marry. Ethan Moore. He was surrounded by people, laughing easily, his hand gesturing as he spoke, his voice carrying just enough confidence to command attention. Ethan had always been good at that. Good at making people feel impressed. Good at being admired. That was what had drawn Isabella to him years ago. Back then, she believed charm meant depth. She believed confidence meant loyalty. She believed love meant standing beside someone, even when no one was watching. She was wrong. Isabella adjusted the ring on her finger, a modest diamond, chosen more for appearance than meaning. She had never cared about size or price. She cared about intention. Or at least, she used to. Her mother appeared beside her, eyes bright with pride, gently touching Isabella's arm. "You did well tonight," she said softly. "Everyone's talking about how beautiful you look." Isabella smiled, because that was what daughters did. "Have you seen Ethan?" her mother asked. "Yes," Isabella replied calmly, even as her gaze drifted back across the room. She saw him then, leaning close to a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman laughed a little too freely, her hand resting on Ethan's sleeve as if it belonged there. A familiar tightness formed in Isabella's chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was recognition. She had felt this before. The subtle shift. The emotional distance disguised as ambition. The way Ethan had slowly begun to speak at her instead of with her. She had ignored it. She had believed patience would fix what honesty could have ended sooner. A glass clinked against a microphone. The room fell silent. Ethan stepped onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom, smiling broadly. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "This evening means a lot to me." Isabella straightened slightly. This was the moment, she told herself. The moment they would step forward together. The moment that would erase every doubt. Ethan continued speaking, about opportunity, about growth, about the future he envisioned for himself. For himself. Isabella took a step forward, prepared to join him. Then he said a name. Not hers. He invited the young woman beside him onto the stage. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Isabella stopped walking. Her heels felt anchored to the floor. Ethan placed an arm around the woman's waist, his grip confident, possessive. "This may surprise some of you," he said smoothly, "but when clarity arrives, it doesn't wait for comfort." Isabella's heart pounded. He spoke of change. Of evolution. Of realizing he needed someone who matched his ambition now, not someone who reminded him of where he started. Then he looked directly at Isabella. His voice hardened. "You're kind," he said. "But kindness isn't enough in a competitive world." The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. "You built ideas," he continued, "but you never built power. You waited. You hesitated. You believed effort alone was enough." Silence filled the room. "No man," he added calmly, "chooses potential when certainty is standing beside him." Isabella felt something inside her break, not loudly, but completely. The room blurred. Faces turned away. Whispers bloomed. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She turned and walked. Every step toward the exit felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. Outside, the night air was cold and unforgiving. Her breath trembled as she reached the quiet of the empty hallway. She slid the ring from her finger and held it for a moment. Then she let it fall. The sound it made was small. Final. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. As the doors began to close, a hand stopped them. A man entered, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored black suit that looked effortless on him. He didn't rush. He didn't stare. He simply existed with presence. They descended in silence. Then he spoke. "That was poorly executed," he said evenly. Isabella let out a short, humorless breath. "That's one way to describe it." He turned slightly toward her. "No," he said. "Cruel usually is." She glanced at him, surprised. "I'm Sebastian Drake," he continued. "And what happened tonight says nothing about your value." The elevator stopped. The doors opened. He didn't move. Instead, he held out a simple card. "Call me when you're ready to stop explaining yourself to people who never listened." Then he stepped out. And just like that, he was gone. Isabella stood alone, the card heavy in her hand. For the first time that night, she felt something unfamiliar. Not heartbreak. Not humiliation. Possibility. And somewhere deep within her, something began to rise. Not anger. Not revenge. But resolve. The morning Isabella Drake walked into the glass tower that housed Drake Global Holdings, she did not feel powerful, confident, or triumphant. She felt exhausted, emotionally bruised, and painfully aware that her life had collapsed in front of an audience that had once applauded her. The city outside moved with its usual urgency, cars flowing through intersections, people rushing toward destinations that mattered to them, unaware that for Isabella, everything had changed. The name on the building bore no connection to her yet, but fate had an ironic way of planting seeds long before anyone recognized their value. She stood in the lobby longer than necessary, steadying her breath, reminding herself that she had not come here to beg for validation or sympathy. She had come because hiding had finally become more frightening than trying again. The days following the engagement disaster had been some of the longest of her life. Messages poured in from people who claimed to care, yet their concern always carried curiosity, as though her pain were entertainment dressed as compassion. Others were silent, their absence louder than any insult Ethan had spoken. Isabella learned quickly who had loved her and who had merely admired her proximity to success. She stopped explaining. She stopped defending herself. Instead, she observed, listened, and allowed disappointment to sharpen her awareness rather than dull her spirit. Pain, she realized, could either hollow a person out or carve them into something stronger. She chose the second option, though the choice did not come without struggle. When she met Sebastian Drake again, it was not in a dramatic moment filled with sweeping music or grand promises. It was in a quiet executive office, minimalist in design, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a calm observer watching chaos from a distance. Sebastian listened far more than he spoke, his presence steady, his gaze analytical without being cold. He did not ask her to recount what had happened at the engagement party. He did not mention Ethan. He did not offer sympathy. Instead, he asked her about her work, about how she saw value, about the patterns she noticed that others ignored. For the first time in weeks, Isabella spoke without feeling judged, interrupted, or measured against someone else's expectations. Sebastian did not offer her a rescue. He offered her responsibility. He explained that Drake Global was restructuring several divisions, that it needed someone capable of rebuilding brands not for attention but for longevity, someone who understood people rather than trends. He made it clear that this opportunity would not come with protection or special treatment. If she failed, she would fail publicly. If she succeeded, the credit would belong to the work, not the story behind her arrival. Isabella accepted without hesitation, not because she was fearless, but because she was tired of being underestimated and tired of shrinking herself to make others comfortable. The first weeks were brutal. She arrived before sunrise and left long after the city lights blurred into streaks against the night sky. There were meetings where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else, moments where silence followed her suggestions, and subtle reminders that she was an outsider stepping into a world that did not yet respect her presence. Isabella did not fight loudly. She did not demand attention. She documented everything, refined her strategies, and let results speak where words failed. Slowly, metrics shifted. Engagement improved. Consumer trust increased. Markets responded. Numbers, unlike people, did not lie. What no one noticed at first was how Isabella herself was changing. The softness Ethan had mocked was not disappearing. It was being disciplined. Compassion became discernment. Patience became precision. Kindness became a strength she wielded deliberately instead of freely giving away. She learned to set boundaries without guilt, to say no without apology, and to walk away from conversations that drained rather than built. Her posture changed. Her voice steadied. She no longer sought approval in rooms that thrived on ego. Instead, she focused on impact. Outside the office, her personal life remained quiet. She declined invitations, avoided social circles tied to her past, and resisted the urge to monitor Ethan's life through whispered updates and online glimpses. She knew that comparison was a trap, and she refused to let her healing depend on someone else's downfall. Growth, she discovered, was not loud. It happened in solitude, in consistency, in choosing discipline on days when motivation failed. Each morning she woke with the same question: what would the woman I am becoming do today? And each night she measured herself not by applause, but by integrity. Sebastian watched from a distance, never interfering, never hovering. He believed in observation before judgment, and what he observed impressed him. Isabella did not seek mentorship, yet she absorbed knowledge like someone starving for mastery. She challenged assumptions respectfully, rebuilt systems others had abandoned, and earned loyalty without demanding it. People began to listen. Teams requested her involvement. Decisions once made without her now waited for her input. Influence, she learned, did not require dominance. It required consistency. Months passed. The world that had once dismissed her quietly recalibrated its opinion. Articles mentioned Drake Global's renewed consumer trust strategy without naming her directly, yet her fingerprints were everywhere. She did not chase recognition, but recognition began to chase her. Meanwhile, whispers from her past reached her ears. Ethan's ventures were unstable. Partnerships dissolved. The woman he had chosen as certainty proved to be temporary. Isabella felt no satisfaction in this knowledge, only confirmation that arrogance eventually collapses under its own weight. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Isabella stood by the window of her office, looking out at the city she once felt lost in. She no longer felt small beneath its skyline. She felt aligned. Sebastian appeared quietly, standing beside her, not invading her space, simply sharing the view. He spoke then, not about work, not about success, but about resilience, about how the most dangerous thing someone could do was underestimate a person who had learned to rebuild themselves without applause. Isabella smiled, not because she felt validated, but because she finally recognized herself again. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind on a stage while others watched. She was becoming the woman people would one day rise when she entered the room, not out of obligation, but out of respect. And though she did not know it yet, the world that once dismissed her was preparing to witness her return, not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone whose presence alone rewrote the narrative. Success did not announce itself loudly when it arrived in Isabella Drake's life. It came quietly, almost cautiously, as though testing whether she would recognize it without needing applause. The first visible shift was not a headline or an award but a change in how rooms responded to her presence. Meetings that once spoke over her now paused when she entered. Conversations adjusted their tone. Decisions slowed until her perspective was heard. It was subtle, almost invisible to outsiders, but to Isabella, it was unmistakable proof that consistency had begun to reshape perception. She no longer introduced herself with explanations or qualifications. Her work had become her introduction, and her calm authority carried more weight than any title ever could. Drake Global Holdings expanded aggressively that year, not through reckless acquisitions or flashy announcements, but through strategic moves that emphasized sustainability over spectacle. The consumer division Isabella had rebuilt became the company's strongest pillar, outperforming competitors that relied on trends rather than trust. Investors noticed. Industry leaders took interest. Panels invited her name. Interviews requested her insight. Yet Isabella remained selective, aware that visibility without purpose could become distraction. She remembered too well what it felt like to be valued for proximity rather than substance, and she refused to repeat that cycle under a different name. Sebastian Drake's role in her life evolved alongside her growth, though never in ways that felt forced or inappropriate. He remained professional, measured, and deeply respectful, allowing Isabella to stand fully on her own merit. When they spoke, it was often about strategy, long-term vision, and the responsibility that came with influence. He challenged her thinking without undermining her confidence and trusted her judgment without hesitation. In him, Isabella found something she had never experienced before: partnership without control, support without conditions, respect without competition. It was unfamiliar, and because of that, she treated it carefully, knowing that trust built slowly lasted longer. The first true collision with her past came at an industry summit held in New York, an event that gathered executives, founders, and investors from across the country. Isabella attended not as a guest but as a keynote contributor, representing Drake Global's consumer innovation strategy. As she walked through the venue, dressed with understated elegance and unmistakable confidence, conversations turned subtly in her wake. People recognized her now, not as someone's former partner, not as a cautionary tale, but as a leader whose rise had been impossible to ignore. Ethan Moore was there. He stood near the back of the room when she took the stage, older than she remembered, his confidence dulled by the quiet desperation of someone still chasing validation rather than building value. Isabella did not look at him directly, yet she felt the weight of his attention like a familiar echo she no longer feared. As she spoke, her voice steady and precise, she outlined principles of ethical growth, long-term trust, and leadership grounded in accountability rather than ego. There was no bitterness in her words, no subtle references to betrayal or loss. Her success spoke clearly enough on its own. For Ethan, the realization was devastating. The woman he had dismissed as weak now commanded the respect of the very people he once sought to impress. The certainty he had chosen had long since faded, replaced by instability and regret. Watching Isabella, he understood something far too late. She had not needed him to succeed, but he had relied on her far more than he ever admitted. That understanding settled heavily, not as anger, but as shame. Isabella felt no triumph in his discomfort. Growth had taught her that true power did not require witnesses, and healing did not demand closure from those who caused harm. After her session concluded, she exited the stage to a standing response that felt surreal in its quiet dignity. Sebastian waited nearby, offering nothing more than a nod of acknowledgement, as though to say that this moment belonged entirely to her. And it did. As months passed, Isabella's influence extended beyond Drake Global. She became an advocate for ethical leadership, mentoring young professionals who reminded her of the woman she once was: eager, capable, and unaware of her own worth. She taught them not how to win approval, but how to build resilience, not how to impress, but how to endure. Her story, though rarely shared in full, inspired others who had been underestimated, overlooked, or discarded for daring to grow at their own pace. What Isabella did not anticipate was how public perception would soon intertwine her name with Sebastian Drake's. Speculation began quietly, fueled by shared appearances, aligned vision, and mutual respect that was impossible to ignore. She resisted the narrative at first, protective of the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. But over time, she realized that strength did not diminish when shared with the right person. It multiplied. One evening, standing on the balcony of a high-rise overlooking the city, Isabella reflected on how far she had come. The humiliation that once defined her had become a distant memory, no longer sharp enough to wound. She had rebuilt not just her career, but her identity, learning that worth was not something granted by others, but something claimed through action and integrity. The woman who had once been told no man would want her now stood as someone whose presence commanded respect, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. And though the world was beginning to watch her closely, Isabella understood that her greatest victory was internal. She no longer needed to prove herself to anyone who failed to see her value. She had outgrown the version of herself that accepted conditional love and borrowed confidence. What lay ahead was not revenge, not validation, but something far more powerful: legacy. By the time Isabella Drake's name began circulating in global business circles, it was no longer attached to whispers of reinvention or curiosity about her past. It was spoken with certainty. Her leadership style, defined by discipline rather than dominance and vision rather than vanity, became a case study discussed in boardrooms and universities alike. Drake Global Holdings announced its most successful fiscal year in over a decade, and the consumer division Isabella had built from the ground up was credited as the foundation of that success. Analysts praised its ethical approach, customers trusted its transparency, and employees felt something rare in modern corporations: stability paired with purpose. Isabella did not celebrate loudly. She had learned that lasting success rarely required noise. It required alignment. As recognition grew, so did scrutiny. Media outlets speculated endlessly about her partnership with Sebastian Drake, attempting to reduce years of hard-earned credibility into a convenient narrative of association. Isabella refused to address it publicly, not out of secrecy, but out of principle. She knew that love, like leadership, thrived best when it was not performed for approval. Behind closed doors, however, something profound was unfolding. Sebastian, always composed and deliberate, revealed layers of vulnerability that few had ever seen. He spoke of the loneliness that came with building an empire, of the weight of expectations inherited and imposed, and of the quiet admiration he had felt watching Isabella rise without losing herself. Their bond grew not from shared ambition alone, but from mutual respect, patience, and an understanding that strength did not require constant assertion. The defining moment came at a charity gala held in Chicago, hosted to fund educational initiatives for underserved communities. It was a return to the city where Isabella's humiliation had once unfolded, though the contrast could not have been more striking. This time, she arrived not as someone standing behind another's shadow, but as a leader whose presence commanded attention effortlessly. When Sebastian walked beside her, there was no announcement, no declaration, yet the room understood. Their connection was evident not in gestures, but in ease. In the way conversations paused. In the way eyes followed. In the way respect filled the silence. Among the attendees were familiar faces from Isabella's past, including those who had once looked away when she needed support the most. Ethan was there too, though diminished, his confidence fractured by failures he could no longer mask. When their eyes met across the room, Isabella felt no surge of emotion, no tightening of her chest. She felt clarity. The power dynamic that once haunted her no longer existed. She had outgrown the need to be seen by him, and in doing so, she had reclaimed something far more valuable than vindication: peace. Later that evening, Sebastian took the stage, not to speak of profits or growth, but of values. He spoke about the importance of leaders who rebuild rather than discard, who recognize potential rather than exploit it, and who understand that the measure of success lies not in how many people one stands above, but in how many are lifted along the way. When he introduced Isabella, not by title but by impact, the applause that followed was not polite or obligatory. It was earned. And as Isabella addressed the room, she spoke not of her fall, but of resilience, of choosing growth over bitterness, of learning that rejection often clears the path for alignment. Her words resonated deeply, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. That night marked a turning point not just professionally, but personally. In the quiet aftermath, away from cameras and conversations, Sebastian asked Isabella a simple question, one that carried no pressure or expectation. He asked her what she wanted, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Isabella answered without hesitation. She wanted partnership rooted in respect, growth that did not demand self-erasure, and a future that honored who she had become, not who she once was. Sebastian listened, as he always had, and in his response, there was certainty without control, commitment without condition. In the weeks that followed, their relationship became known, not through spectacle, but through consistency. They supported each other publicly and privately, never competing, never overshadowing. Isabella remained fiercely independent, her identity intact, her authority unquestioned. She did not become someone's accessory. She became someone's equal. And the world, watching closely, began to shift its narrative. The story was no longer about a woman discarded and replaced. It was about a woman who rose, rebuilt, and redefined power on her own terms. As Isabella reflected on her journey, she recognized the irony that what once felt like an ending had been an opening she never would have chosen but desperately needed. The words that once tried to diminish her now felt distant, stripped of their power. She had learned that worth was not negotiated, love was not proven through sacrifice, and success was not owed to those who doubted her. It belonged to those who endured, evolved, and refused to abandon themselves. And though the world saw her now as a symbol of resilience and success, Isabella understood that her greatest achievement was internal. She no longer feared being unwanted, underestimated, or left behind. She had become someone who walked forward with certainty, knowing that true value was not granted by others, but built through courage, consistency, and self-respect. Time has a way of revealing truths that emotions once hid, and as the years unfolded, Isabella Drake came to understand that her greatest victory had never been standing taller than those who doubted her, but standing firmly within herself. The world now recognized her as a leader of substance, a woman whose name carried weight not because of association, but because of impact. Drake Global Holdings flourished under a culture she helped shape, one that valued integrity over intimidation and vision over vanity. Isabella's influence extended beyond corporate walls, touching communities, inspiring young professionals, and reshaping conversations about what strength truly looked like when expressed without cruelty. She had become proof that resilience did not require hardness, and ambition did not demand the loss of empathy. Her relationship with Sebastian Drake matured quietly, grounded in mutual respect and shared purpose rather than public spectacle. Their partnership was not built on saving one another, but on walking forward together, fully formed and self-aware. Sebastian never tried to define Isabella's success, and Isabella never sought to soften his authority. They understood something rare. Love did not ask for sacrifice of identity, only the willingness to grow alongside someone who honored it. When they eventually married, it was not announced as a triumph over the past, but as a celebration of alignment, witnessed by those who truly knew their journey. There was no grand declaration meant to impress the world, because the world had already seen enough. The final confrontation with Isabella's past came not through confrontation at all, but through contrast. Ethan Moore's name occasionally surfaced in business circles, often attached to failed ventures and unfulfilled promises. When their paths crossed one last time at a public event, there was no tension, no unresolved emotion. Ethan looked at Isabella with a mixture of regret and disbelief, as if still trying to understand how the woman he once dismissed had become everything he could not. Isabella met his gaze calmly, without bitterness, without triumph. In that moment, the power dynamic dissolved completely. She owed him nothing, not even forgiveness, because forgiveness had already occurred quietly within her long before. As Isabella stood on the balcony of her home overlooking the city she once feared would swallow her whole, she reflected on the woman she used to be. She remembered the self-doubt, the desire to be chosen, the willingness to shrink for love that demanded sacrifice without reciprocity. That version of herself no longer felt embarrassing or weak. She felt compassion for her. That woman had survived heartbreak, humiliation, and loss without knowing what waited on the other side. She had endured so that this version could exist. And that realization brought peace deeper than any achievement ever could. Isabella began dedicating more time to mentorship and philanthropy, funding initiatives that empowered women to rebuild after personal and professional setbacks. She spoke openly, not about her pain, but about the importance of discernment, self-worth, and patience. She taught that rejection was not a verdict, but redirection, and that being underestimated often meant freedom to grow unnoticed. Her story inspired those who felt discarded, reminding them that endings imposed by others often become beginnings authored by courage. In the end, Isabella Drake did not prove her worth by becoming someone else's bride, someone else's success story, or someone else's validation. She proved it by becoming whole. The words once spoken to diminish her lost their meaning, stripped of power by the life she built in defiance of them. She learned that true value could not be taken, only surrendered, and she had reclaimed hers fully. The world remembered her as a leader, a strategist, a visionary. But Isabella remembered herself as the woman who chose growth over bitterness, dignity over desperation, and purpose over revenge. And that choice, made quietly on a night when everything seemed lost, became the foundation of a legacy no one could ever take away.